We're diving into this research on the environmental impacts of organic versus non-organic coffee farming.
Okay.
I'll be honest, I
Right.
usually just grab whatever bag of beans smells the best at the store.
Yeah.
But this deep dive is really making me rethink my coffee routine. We've got excerpts from this pretty dense scientific review article,
Okay.
and it's got all these studies about pesticides in coffee.
Hmm.
Everything from how they affect the soil and water to like how much of it ends up in our cups.
It's a question a lot of people have, right? Is organic coffee actually better for the environment?
Right.
And these studies, they give some pretty surprising answers.
Yeah, for sure. So to start, can we just break down some of the basics?
Yes.
I think most of us know that coffee plants, they can be vulnerable to like pests and diseases and stuff. But what's the conventional approach for dealing with that?
Well, traditionally, a lot of farmers use pesticides to try to protect their crops.
Yeah.
But as these studies kind of point out, that comes with a whole other set of consequences. It's not just about what ends up in your cup.
Right.
It's about, the health of the farmers, the ecosystems around the farms, and just the long-term sustainability of coffee production.
Yeah, that's something I hadn't really thought about too much before. I knew pesticides weren't, healthy.
Mm-hmm.
But can we get into like the specifics of those risks?
Yeah, definitely. The research points out some pretty alarming stuff about the risks of pesticides to coffee farmers.
Okay.
There was one study that found something like 87% of the farmers in their sample, they weren't even wearing masks or gloves when they were spraying their crops.
Wow.
So this constant exposure, it can lead to things like respiratory problems,
Yeah. Oh.
skin irritation, and, potentially even more serious long-term health issues.
That's really concerning.
Yeah.
It makes you think about the human cost behind every cup of coffee you have.
Mm-hmm.
What about the environmental impact?
Well, pesticides, they don't just stay on the plants. They
Wow.
can leach into the soil and contaminate water sources, which obviously has a big impact on the entire ecosystem. Imagine these chemicals seeping into rivers and streams,
Yeah.
affecting the wildlife and even getting into the groundwater that communities rely on.
That's crazy. I remember the research mentioned a study specifically from Brazil, which is like the biggest coffee producer in the world.
Exactly.
That kind of drives this point home, right?
Yeah, they found that a good portion of the pesticides sprayed on those coffee plantations ended up in both the surface water and the groundwater.
Wow.
I think it was something like 45% reaching surface water and 24% getting into the groundwater.
So like almost half.
Yeah, it's a powerful example of how what we do on farms has effects way beyond just the farms themselves.
Yeah, it's kind of wild to think about how, a cup of coffee could be tied to a water source all the way in Brazil.
Yeah,
So we've laid out some of the downsides of using pesticides.
right.
But how does organic farming kind of fit into all this? Is it like the eco-friendly answer we often think it is?
That's the million-dollar question. And the research highlights some interesting nuances.
Okay.
One study in Indonesia looked at coffee crops grown both organically and conventionally over a 3-year period. And surprisingly, the level of pest attacks was similar in both groups.
Wait, so similar levels of pests even without using pesticides?
Yep.
That's unexpected. What did the researchers say about that?
Well, they found that organic farming often leads to more biodiversity,
Okay.
which actually acts as like a natural pest control.
Mm.
So instead of relying on chemicals, organic farms create a more balanced ecosystem where natural predators, like certain insects and birds, can thrive, and they help to keep those pest populations under control.
So it's like building a natural defense system right into the farm.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
Yeah,
It makes me think that organic farming could be a much more sustainable approach over the long term.
that's definitely one of the arguments for it. By encouraging biodiversity, organic farms can help maintain soil health and reduce the reliance on those synthetic pesticides, which, is good for the environment and for human health, but there's always more to the story.
Okay, I'm listening. What other factors should we consider when we're comparing organic and non-organic coffee?
Well, organic farming, it definitely has its benefits for the environment, but we also got to acknowledge some of the challenges.
Okay, like what?
Well, for one, organic farming often needs like way more hands-on labor, which can mean, higher costs for farmers and then for us as consumers too.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you're not taking those chemical shortcuts, there's probably a lot more actual work involved.
Right.
Are there other things that contribute to that higher price tag on organic coffee?
Yeah, so organic farming it often leads to lower yields compared to conventional methods.
Okay.
That means organic farmers, they're producing less coffee per acre, which can also drive up the cost.
So it's like this whole complicated thing with the yields and the labor and what people are willing to pay all affecting the final price we see.
Exactly.
But just thinking about it from the environmental side, are there any like downsides to organic farming that we should know about?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
And it shows why it's so important to look at the whole picture.
Okay.
So organic farming generally avoids those synthetic pesticides,
Right.
but it doesn't mean it's completely impact-free.
Hmm.
For instance, some organic farmers, they might use natural pesticides,
Okay.
which can still impact the environment depending on what it is and how they're using it.
That's true. Organic doesn't automatically mean perfect.
Exactly.
Sounds like no matter what approach you're taking, responsible land management is key.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, are there any other environmental impacts besides just pesticides that we should be thinking about when it comes to coffee?
Absolutely.
Okay.
A huge one is water usage. Coffee, it needs a lot of water to grow. And if you're not careful with irrigation, it can deplete water resources and damage ecosystems.
That's a big concern, especially in places that are already struggling with water shortages.
Right.
Does the research say anything about how water usage is different between organic and non-organic coffee farming?
You know, the research we have doesn't go super deep into water use specifically,
Oh,
but it does kind of hint at a broader point.
what's that?
Sustainable practices, they're important no matter if a farm is organic or not.
Okay, so it's not as simple as saying one method is always better for water,
Right.
but how can coffee farmers, both organic and conventional, make sure they're using water responsibly?
There are a bunch of techniques farmers can use,
Like what?
like drip irrigation,
Okay.
which delivers water right to the roots of the plants, so you're minimizing evaporation and waste.
So it's all about being aware of that water footprint,
Yeah.
no matter what type of coffee you're growing.
What about soil health?
Yeah.
We already talked about pesticide contamination.
But are there other ways that coffee farming can affect the soil?
Soil health, it's super important for sustainable coffee production.
Hmm.
One of the main problems is soil erosion,
Oh, okay.
which happens when land is cleared for coffee plantations
Right.
and the natural vegetation is removed.
So without those roots to hold the soil in place, it's more likely to just get washed away by rain or wind.
Exactly.
That can't be good in the long run.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
And it leads to other problems like sedimentation in waterways,
Okay.
which can harm aquatic life.
So how can coffee farmers protect the soil and reduce these risks?
There are a few strategies.
Yeah.
One is to keep a layer of organic matter on the soil surface.
Okay.
You can do that with cover crops, which are basically plants you grow specifically to protect the soil,
Okay.
or with mulching, which is adding a layer of like leaves or wood chips around the plants.
So it's like giving the soil a little blanket to protect it from the elements and keep
Yeah.
it moist.
Exactly.
Are there other ways to prevent erosion?
Oh, yeah.
What else?
Another important one is terracing,
Okay.
which is making level platforms on slopes to slow down water runoff. So it
Mhm.
stops the soil from washing away and helps the water soak into the soil better.
It sounds like these techniques like terracing and cover crops,
Mm-hmm.
they can help both organic and conventional farms.
That's right.
Yeah.
Sustainable soil management is super important for all coffee farms, no matter how they're certified or their methods.
Okay, so we've covered water usage and soil health. What about biodiversity? We talked about how organic farming can help it, but is there like a downside with conventional farming when it comes to biodiversity?
There can be. Using synthetic pesticides, it can really impact biodiversity.
Okay.
The chemicals can kill beneficial insects, disrupt the balance of the ecosystem,
Okay.
and even harm animals that rely on those insects for food.
It's like this chain reaction where one action can have all these unintended consequences throughout the whole food web.
Exactly.
It makes me wonder if there's a way to kind of bridge the gap between organic and conventional farming. Find a middle ground that combines the best of both.
Yeah,
Does the research mention any alternative approaches that might help with these issues?
it does.
Okay, tell me more.
There are some really promising practices that are becoming more popular,
Okay.
and they're focused on reducing the impact of coffee farming without necessarily sticking to those strict organic standards.
That's great to hear. What do those alternative approaches look like?
Well, one example is integrated pest management, or IPM.
IPM, huh?
Yeah.
That's a new one for me.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
So IPM, it's like a more well-rounded way of dealing with pests,
Okay.
and it focuses more on prevention and monitoring instead of just spraying chemicals everywhere.
All right.
It's all about watching those pest populations really carefully,
Mm-hmm.
figuring out like at what point they actually become a problem,
Right.
and then using a bunch of different methods to manage them.
So you're being more proactive and strategic instead of just reacting when it's too late.
Exactly.
Okay, so what kind of strategies are we talking about here?
Well, you could introduce beneficial insects,
Hi.
like ones that prey on the pests you don't want.
Mm.
Or you could use things like traps or barriers to keep them away.
Right.
You could even change up your planting times
Mm-hmm.
to try to avoid those peak times when the pests are most active.
Okay.
And then if you absolutely have to use pesticides,
Yeah.
you do it very carefully as like a last resort
Okay.
to minimize the impact.
So it's a more balanced approach, right? You're taking the environment into consideration.
Exactly.
Are there any other, like, cutting-edge techniques being used in coffee farming that you're excited about?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
What else is out there?
One cool one is agroforestry,
Okay, I've heard of that.
which is basically integrating trees into the coffee farms.
Okay.
This provides shade for the coffee plants,
Mm-hmm.
which reduces stress from too much sun and also improves the soil.
Right.
Plus, it creates a habitat for all those good insects and wildlife.
So it's more like how things would be naturally in an ecosystem,
Right, exactly.
instead of these big plantations with only one type of plant,
Exactly.
which can be way more susceptible to pests and diseases.
Right. And the cool thing about agroforestry is it can benefit the farmers financially too.
Oh, how so?
They can get more income from the trees themselves.
Oh, right, like from timber or fruit trees.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a win-win for both the environment and the farmers.
Absolutely.
Wow. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm realizing that my coffee choices have a bigger impact than I thought.
It's true. That journey from the farm to your cup is a long one. And
Yeah.
every sip we take is connected to all these environmental and social things.
Right.
But by understanding those connections, we can make better choices that support a healthier planet and a more sustainable coffee industry.
Absolutely. So what are some key things you hope our listeners will remember from all of this?
I think the main takeaway is that there isn't one perfect solution to sustainable coffee.
Okay.
Organic farming has its perks for the environment, but it has its own set of challenges.
Hmm.
Conventional farming, it often gets linked to pesticide use,
Right.
but those farms can also adopt sustainable practices to reduce their impact.
So it sounds like the important thing is for us as consumers to be informed
Yes,
and to support brands that are making an effort to be more sustainable.
absolutely. Every choice we make as consumers sends a message.
Mm-hmm.
By picking coffee that's grown in a way that respects both the planet and the people who grow it, we can contribute to a better future for everyone.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
Yeah.
I'm
Yes.
definitely inspired to look into the different certifications out there and to support those coffee brands that align with my values.
That's great.
And as always, we'll have links to the research we talked about and some other helpful resources in the show notes for anyone who wants to explore this topic further.
Remember, even those small changes in our coffee habits can have an impact.
Right.
Whether it's trying a more sustainable brand, cutting back on how much we drink, or just thinking about where our coffee comes from every little bit helps.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of organic versus non-organic coffee farming.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
It's been a really interesting conversation,
Yeah, it has.
and hopefully you'll encourage everyone listening to give their next cup of coffee a little more thought.
Until next time, happy brewing.